They came in the dead of night, fake badges glinting under moonlight, trying to cuff a 9-year-old boy. No warrant, no authority, just raw intimidation. They thought they could bully their way through, claiming to enforce rules that didn't exist. But they didn't count on his father, a Marine veteran who'd lost too much to let anyone touch his son. What happened next wasn't just a standoff, it was a reckoning that shook the town and sparked debates everywhere. Wait until you hear how this story unfolded and why justice didn't just whisper, it roared. It was 5 a.m. On a quiet Saturday in a small Texas town, the kind of stillness that blankets the world before dawn. The air was cool, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves through an open window. In his bedroom, John Carter, a former Marine turned mechanic, was stirring awake. In the next room, his 9-year-old son, Ethan, slept soundly, clutching a worn stuffed bear his mother had given him before cancer claimed her 2 years ago. John had seen war, buried his wife, and poured everything into raising Ethan alone. Nothing could have prepared him for what came next. A sharp knock shattered the silence, then another, louder, aggressive. Someone wasn't asking for entry, they were demanding it. John's body tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol on his nightstand, unloaded, magazine separate, safety first with a kid in the house. But this didn't feel safe. "Neighborhood patrol, open the door!" a voice barked. Neighborhood patrol? John owned his land outright, paid his taxes, and kept his yard clean. There was no HOA, no patrol, nothing. Dread coiled in his gut. Something was wrong. Then he heard it, Ethan's soft whimper from the next room. The boy was awake, the knocking loud enough to rattle the walls. John moved toward the hallway, but before he could reach Ethan's door, he heard the sound every parent dreads, the front door creaking open. Ethan, curious and scared, was heading toward it. John's heart stopped. He sprinted to the closet, ripped open the safe, and slammed the magazine into his Glock with the precision of a man who'd done it under fire. Every second stretched into eternity as he raced to the front hall, his mind locked on one thing: Ethan. "Ethan, get down!" a voice bellowed outside, harsh and commanding. John's blood turned to ice. "Dad!" Ethan screamed, his voice cracking with terror. "They're grabbing me!" That cry tore through John like a bullet, resetting his entire existence. The world shrank to the front door. He didn't walk, he charged, weapon in hand, heart hammering like it had in Iraq. This wasn't a war zone. This was his home, and someone had dared to touch his child. The door didn't open, it exploded. John tore through it, barely registering the hallway or the cold floor beneath his bare feet. Instinct drove him, fury fueling every step. Outside, 2 men stood on the lawn, one in a black jacket with a cheap plastic badge reading "Neighborhood Enforcement." The other gripped flimsy handcuffs, the kind bought online, not issued. They wore mismatched boots, crooked patches, and carried themselves with a cocky aggression that screamed fake. In the middle was Ethan, his small arms pinned by both men, eyes wide with fear, trembling, sobbing. He wasn't fighting back. He couldn't. He was just a boy. John's voice erupted, raw and unshakable. "Let go of my son!" "Now." The man with the badge turned, annoyed but unafraid. "Sir, step back. We're conducting an arrest for community code violations." John didn't blink. "There's no HOA here." The man smirked. "There is now. Section 5 of the revised charter." "Charter?" John stepped closer, his voice low, every word carved from years of discipline. "He's a child." The man with the cuffs ignored him, moving to snap a cuff on Ethan's wrist. Ethan cried out, a sound that shattered the night, and John's restraint. That was it. These weren't officers. They were imposters, men who decided they could play God, inventing rules to terrorize a child in the dark. John's grip tightened on the Glock, his steps slowing, deliberate. He saw the flicker in the man's eyes, the moment he realized John wasn't shouting anymore. Words were done. John raised the pistol. "Drop the cuffs, or I end this before you blink." The younger man, hands shaking, raised his arms instantly. The other, taller, with dark hair and a smug grin, didn't budge. "You wouldn't," he muttered. "This is official business." Click. John chambered around, the sound cutting through the silence like a guillotine. His eyes locked on the man, unyielding, the stare of someone who'd seen death and dealt it. "You touched my son. You dragged him out here. I could pull this trigger 3 times before you finish your next breath. Want to test me?" The grin vanished. The cuffs hit the dirt with a dull thud. Ethan broke free, stumbling into John's arm. John knelt, pulling his son close with one hand, the Glock still steady in the other, trained downward but ready. "Face down, both of you. Hands where I can see them," John ordered, his voice cold as steel. They hesitated but complied, slowly, grudgingly. Ethan clung to him, shaking, as John stood over the men, his breathing even, his stance unbreakable. "My neighbor's a retired cop. He's coming. You'll explain to him why you thought you could touch a 9-year-old. One man tried to speak." John moved like lightning, striking the ground beside his head with the pistol's frame. Dirt exploded. "I said nothing," John growled. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. The moon hung high, shadows stretching across the lawn. John didn't waver, his Glock steady, Ethan pressed against his side. Tires squealed faintly in the distance. Tom Harris, the neighbor, arrived in a robe, flashlight in hand, his sheriff's instincts kicking in. One glance at John, Ethan, and the men in the dirt told him everything. He didn't speak, just called it in. When Tom called, people moved. 15 minutes later, the street blazed with red and blue. 7 patrol cars lined the curb, spotlights flooding the lawn. Neighbors peeked from windows, too scared to step out. Sergeant Emily Torres, mid-40s, calm and no-nonsense, stepped forward. Her boots crunched on gravel as she sized up the scene, fake badges, a trembling child, and 2 men still prone. "Got a warrant?" she asked, voice like a blade. One man lifted his head. "We're under neighborhood protocol. You have no authority to detain a kid," Torres snapped. "This is trespassing, attempted abduction, endangering a child. And that's just the start." She gestured to the street. "Federal agents are coming. So are the Carter family's lawyers." The men said nothing. The weight of their mistake crushed them. John stood silent, Ethan in his arms, the boys shaking easing, but his grip was tight. Torres approached. "You okay, Mr. Carter?" John nodded. "Ethan?" The boy nodded, face buried in his dad's chest. Torres muttered. "He didn't shoot, but every cop here knows he could have. And no one would have blamed him." John wasn't cuffed. It wasn't an arrest, just procedure. He rode to the station, Glock unloaded, magazine separate, as always. Ethan stayed with Torres and a trauma specialist, safe at last. At the station, the questions were brief. "Why'd you draw your weapon?" "They were taking my son." "No ID, no warrant, cuffs on a kid." "I warned them." "I didn't fire." The captain nodded slowly. Torres' lips twitched, almost a smile. "Anything else?" John's voice was steady. "If I'd been 30 seconds later, you'd be at a funeral, not questioning me." The room went still. The investigation unraveled the truth. The men, Paul Mason and Greg Wells, weren't random. Mason, former HOA president, burned with resentment after the HOA's collapse amid embezzlement scandals. Wells, his friend from a gun club, ranted about restoring order. They formed a fake neighborhood patrol, with printed IDs and late-night walks, harassing residents until they targeted Ethan over a broken mailbox number. They wanted to teach a lesson. They didn't know John Carter was a Marine who'd sworn to protect his son at all costs. The courtroom was quiet, packed with onlookers seeking clarity. Mason and Wells, stripped of their fake badges, looked small. Prosecutor Sarah Nguyen didn't shout. She didn't need to. This was no mistake. They waited until night, wore uniforms to intimidate, and targeted a child, thinking no one would stop them. She faced the jury. If John Carter had been late, we'd be mourning a boy. The defense claimed confusion, citing old HOA rules. The judge shut it down. You faked authority and terrorized a child. That's not the law. That's control. Mason got 12 years, Wells 9, both banned from contacting the Carters forever. John skipped the trial. That morning, he and Ethan were at a park, the boy's laughter echoing as he kicked a ball. It was their first time back since the incident. John stood relaxed, no longer scanning for threats, just present. A reporter approached. Mr. Carter, a statement? John glanced at Ethan, who smiled up at him. Men with weapons should fear the law, he said. But the law should fear a man protecting his child. He hoisted Ethan onto his shoulders and walked away, into life, not just safety. 3 months later, a knock came. John opened the door to 3 city officials, led by Laura Bennett of the new Community Safety Commission. We're not here to enforce, she said. We're here to thank you. She handed him an envelope with a city seal. After your incident, we passed the Ethan Law. No more private patrols, only certified security. It's because you acted. Ethan stood beside John, taller, unafraid, smiling. Inside the envelope was a commendation, a police chief's note, and a crayon card from school kids. Thank you for being brave. That night, John opened his safe. The Glock sat ready, magazine separate, a silent vow. He locked it and stood in the quiet, not from fear, but duty. Some nights peace is a gift. Others it's a fight. This story raises hard questions. Was John Carter a hero or a vigilante? Did he go too far, or was his restraint the real courage? And what about Mason and Wells? Were they just misguided, or something darker? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's debate. When does protecting your cross align? Your voice matters, and this conversation could spark the next big discussion on YouTube. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let's keep this story alive.